Where do you see this relationship going? Have you ever been asked that question? Have you ever asked that question to somebody? I remember several years ago, and let's be honest, I'm beginning to have a few gray hairs in my head. This actually is several decades ago. I had a friend who thought he was going to be asked this question. There's a young lady he'd been dating, and she had told him she wanted to talk. And he was fairly certain this was the question she would want to talk about. And so he came to talk to me about how he should talk to her. And I said, well, how do you feel about her? He said, well, I really, really like her. I love taking her to the movies. I just don't know if I'm ready to take her home to mama. And we talked, and he just wasn't sure. And so finally I had to look at him and say, now, I know you're not that religious of a guy, but I think we need to pray. I think that's where we're at. We just need to pray a little bit before this conversation. Whenever that question is asked, where do you see this relationship going? It is often an invitation to go deeper and an invitation to take the steps that you would have to take in order to go deeper in the relationship. And during this Easter season, as we celebrate the way Jesus' resurrection invites us into a new life, we recognize that Jesus' resurrection is an invitation to the world to journey deeper into the ways of God. That Jesus' resurrection overcomes all our sin, it overcomes any barrier that would separate us from God, and it invites us to make our life about the living God. It shows us that the living God has power over all the ways of our world and invites us to make our life about that relationship. Not to allow that relationship to be something we do on the side while we take care of real life, but to find our real life in that relationship and allow that relationship to shape everything else about us. Now, it's never been easy for us to recognize all of God's work in the world. It's easy for us to more compartmentalize our lives and say, now we're doing our God thing, God, now we're doing our other thing. And sometimes when things don't go the way we want them to go, it's easy for us to say, God, we're not sure if you've really got all this under control. And if you've struggled with that before, well, then you're in good company with Jesus' first disciples. Today we're looking at a story. This is just after Jesus has been resurrected. Two of his disciples who don't realize he's been resurrected yet. Now they've been told, but they don't yet believe. They haven't seen for themselves. They're walking on the road to Emmaus, and they were going from Jerusalem to a town called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away. Now, this is not just like you don't walk 7 miles to run an errand, right? This isn't like when you say, hey, I'm going to go down to Turkey Creek. No, this is much more symbolic what they're doing walking these 7 miles. They are walking away from Jerusalem. They are walking away from Jesus' followers, where the followers are still gathered. They're walking away from the Jesus movement. They're saying, you know what? Jesus was an inspiring figure. I'll appreciate a lot I learned from him, but his movement died with him on the cross. And it's time to get back to living our real lives. But while they're walking that way, this man shows up. And he starts to walk with them. And he starts to talk to them. And they're quite downcast and depressed, as you can imagine. And he starts to tell them to think differently. That what was going on was actually predicted by the scriptures. And then we're going to pick up with the story here right after he begins to tell them about these scriptural predictions. This is Luke 24, beginning with verse 27. Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" And then they go on, and as you can imagine, they turn around, they go back to Jerusalem, and they rejoin the Jesus movement. Now, what they experienced was an invitation to go deeper. Their faith was on this level. They had to learn that God was working on this level. And this man who turned out to be Jesus gave them that invitation to go deeper, to make their life all about their faith. And we need to recognize in our lives signs that it's time for us to go deeper. Now, it might come differently. We don't normally walk 7 miles to get to a different town. If we do, it's usually because we're in the Smokies, going on a hike where we're actually trying to kind of find God in the beauty of creation, not get away from the Jesus movement. But there are still signs in our lives that the resurrected Christ is present and that he's calling us to go deeper. I can tell you one sign that is quite common is this. You go to church because that's what good people do. If you go to church because that's what good people do, this is an invitation for you to go deeper. Now, if this is you, I'm glad you go to church. And I'm glad you enjoy it. And I imagine you probably come because you like the relationships and you enjoy occasionally learning something interesting and having opportunities to serve. And it makes you feel good about yourself. And I'm glad church makes you feel good about yourself. You know, you come to church, you feel like I did this morning what I was supposed to do for God, and so I can go out and I can have whatever I want for lunch, right? We love that feeling that church gives us. And I'm glad you think good people come to church. This church is filled with a lot of good people, and a few we're still working on. But a lot of good people, right? I'm glad for that, but I just don't want you to stay there. It's an invitation to go deeper. And if that's where you are, there may be something holding you back from going deeper. It might be that you just didn't know there was more. Maybe you grew up going to church and that's what you did and you kind of enjoyed it, but your parents, they never really talked about their faith. You know, I can't tell you how many times I do funerals and people say, we always came to church, but mom and dad never said a word about faith outside of church. That's sad to me. Maybe you were raised in that kind of family where it was like, this is just what we do, but we don't really talk about what it means on a deeper level. Maybe your spouse or significant other or friends go to church and you just come along. Maybe that's why you just didn't realize there were more. There are these beliefs we talk about in church and you're just not sure about all that. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's control. Maybe you're worried if you really go deeper, you might have to actually give Jesus control of your life. And you like having control. And I can share with you, I like having control. I really significantly like having control. Do you remember a few years back, Carrie Underwood came out with that song, Jesus Take the Wheel? I remember hearing it for the first time. I remember, no, Jesus. When I invited you to be Lord, I invited you to take the GPS, right? I'm keeping the hands on the wheel. I get it. We like control. We like control a lot, and we're worried sometimes if we begin to let Jesus into part of our life, he'll want into all our life. And the fact is, he will, but it'll be beautiful. Be beautiful when he comes into all our life. I remember some folks who really helped me embrace this for myself. And when I was a teenager, I was at Hickson United Methodist Church, and we had these youth volunteers. And they didn't get paid a dime by the church, but they worked with the teenagers. And they just had this idea that if we came to the church youth group, that we were extending an open invitation for them to get involved in all the details of our lives. They just kind of assumed that, and particularly two of them who were so influential to me, Mike and Rhonda. Suddenly, I just came to youth group, but they were at my ball games. And suddenly they wanted to know what was on my report card. And suddenly, without me telling them, because they asked somebody else, they knew who I was dating. And they had opinions about it and who I should be dating. And they were the type of folks that 20 young adults would go over to their house on Thursday or Friday night for a Bible study, and we'd study the Bible for an hour, and then we'd hang out till 11:30 watching a movie. That's who they were. But they got all involved in the details of my life, and by doing that, they showed me that Jesus wanted to be all involved in the details of my life, because what I knew when they were talking to me about grades, about sports, about girls, about careers, about friendships, they weren't talking to me about what they thought I should do. They were talking to me about how I could learn what Jesus thought I should do. And so I want to tell you that as you get to know Jesus and that worry of giving Jesus control, that it's okay for Jesus to tell you to stay in your lane sometimes. It's not okay for you to tell Jesus to do the same. There are times when Jesus is going to tell you, you know what, I've got this, you just hang where you are. But it's not okay for you to say that to him. Jesus has a lane, and it's called the universe. The universe is Jesus' lane. And Jesus wants to be a part of everything about our lives. If you've been coming to church because that's what good people do, if you wrestle with wanting control and worrying what Jesus would do, maybe it's time for you to stop telling Jesus to stay out of your lane. Maybe it's time to embrace that this universe is Jesus' lane and invite him in. Secondly, another sign that maybe you need to go deeper in your faith. If you struggled with because good people come with the first issue of, well, good people come to church, it might be one of the things you need to do is go deeper by learning more and by really embracing all we can learn from the scriptures and letting our mind be shaped around that. But some of us take that step and then we get into this next issue. Maybe the sign that you need to go deeper is that you have more opinions than principles. Anybody ever been guilty of that? No? I bet you know people who are, right? I bet you know people who have more opinions than principles. Like, they know what everyone else should do, right? They don't necessarily do what they should do, but they know what how everybody else should run. They've got church figured out. They've got politics figured out. They've got business figured out. Oh, you know where you can find some of these people? You ever been to a homeowners association meeting? Right? You can find some of these people there. More opinions than principles. And let's be honest, as Christians, it's easier to get there than we wish it were. I wish I could tell you I don't see this ever cropping up in me, but I see the tendency because you've studied the scriptures, right? You've done that, and you've thought through things. And as Christians, we spend a lot of time thinking about right and wrong and what's right and what's wrong. But suddenly we begin to talk as if we've got it all figured out, but we also, in that talk, sometimes become cynical and jaded. And if you look at our lives, you might not see the principle of compassion, the principle of empathy, the principle of equality, the principle of justice, the principle of service that we see so clearly in Jesus, that we see in Jesus like we've never seen in anyone else. And I can share with you, sometimes I'll listen to myself talk, particularly when I'm talking to some of my friends, and particularly when I think I'm just venting, and I think, am I just making a joke, or am I allowing my heart to begin to become hard? What's really going on here? And do I really think that I'm that much better than these people I'm venting about? If you have more opinions than principles, it's probably because your faith is more in your head than your heart. Because when your faith is in your heart, you focus more on the principles by which Jesus wants you to live your life. When your faith is more in your head, you focus more on how other people should do that themselves. And our faith is supposed to be in our head and our heart. We're supposed to have opinions, but we're supposed to have principles that go much deeper than our opinions. Now, how do we get there? How do we get there? Here's a question for us. Do you believe and trust that Jesus Christ is Lord? Do you believe in your head and trust in your heart that Jesus Christ is Lord? Because we're called to do both. This spring, I've been able to be a part of an incredible group here at the church. It's called the Confirmation Plus class. And this is a group of teenagers who weren't a part of the church as sixth graders. And so they didn't get to go through our 30-week confirmation class where we really share the foundations of faith or in a really in-depth manner before our sixth graders joined the church. So they've been invited to be a part of this class that meets for a couple hours every Sunday afternoon. And we got with them this spring and we said, look, we're going to be with you for hours upon hours every Sunday afternoon for this whole spring. And the only thing we're going to talk about is this one question. We're just going to unpack this one question. Do you believe and trust that Jesus Christ is Lord? Because some of us sometimes get stuck in that believing. You remember what the scriptures say about believing correctly? Say, so you believe correctly. So does the devil. The devil has correct theological beliefs. The devil just doesn't live like you're supposed to. And we, really have just focused incredibly on that. Do you believe and trust that Jesus Christ is Lord? Here's a good way to test yourself if you've moved from belief to trust. Do you remember what the disciples who walked on the road to Emmaus, do you remember what they said when they reflected on their time with this person who they were walking with? When he began to open the scriptures and teach them about how God was at work in the world and in their lives. Do you remember what they said? They said, were not our hearts burning within us, right? Have you ever experienced that? It might be during a sermon, maybe during a Bible study, maybe during a conversation with a friend. It could even be while you watch a TED Talk. I don't know, but you find your heart begin to burn. You find that you realize this is about me. We're talking about me. We're talking about right where my life is right now and right where it needs to go. That's what happens. You experience that. And so the question is, when you experience that, do you lean in or do you back away? Do you find a way to rationalize it away that God's not talking to me? Or do you lean in and do you say, God, what are you really asking me to do? And that temptation to shy away from those moments and to think this isn't really about me, that's a temptation to keep your beliefs largely in your head and not let them fully into your heart. And these disciples had that same temptation. They were walking away, and yet they turned around. Now, there's still another sign that we may need to grow in our faith. And maybe you've learned to go to church to try to experience God and serve God, not just because it's what good people do. And maybe your findings, you have some really strong principles in your life that you live by and that you exhibit, and that if we asked others about you, they would tell us about you. But by all external appearances, you're exactly where you need to be. But internally, you wake up every morning and you wonder if you're good enough. And if you do pretty well that day, you feel pretty good about yourself. And if you don't do so well that day, you wonder if you're really worthy of anything. The third sign that maybe you need to accept Christ's invitation to grow deeper in faith is that you're always worried that you're not good enough. You're always worried that somehow you need to try harder, that somehow you need to do more, and then you'll be good enough. Then you'll be good enough to merit forgiveness. Then you'll be good enough to merit God's approval. Then you'll be good enough to talk to others and not always feel insecure because of how smart or how accomplished they are. Then you'll be good enough. Well, I want to share with you a little bit about these disciples on the road to Emmaus. Do you know why they recognized Jesus? They didn't because they looked real hard. They didn't recognize him because they squeezed their hands together really hard while they spent their 30 minutes in prayer each morning. That's a great thing to do, but that's not why they recognized Jesus. Turns out he was with them all along. And here's what they did. Remember, okay, so he teaches them. Their hearts are burning within them. He's there. They don't know it, but he's there. And let me tell you, whether you know it or not, Jesus is here right now with you. And then he goes on, right? He's walking on. And they invite him to eat with them. They invite him into their lane, right? maybe it's time to do that, because he's not necessarily going to take over. He's going to encounter you. He's going to share with you the message. He's going to make your heart burn within you. But it takes an invitation, because God gave us our hearts, and we are the ones who open or close the door to our hearts. God gave us each that responsibility, and it's going to take that opening, going to take inviting him in, and then it's when they eat with him after he accepts their invitation that they see him and they realize just all that he's up to. And so if you're in this spot, instead of worrying that you're not good enough, maybe it's time to trust that Jesus is. Maybe it's time to start living your life like that. And maybe it would be great to live your life with that joy and that peace that comes from you not having to be perfect every day to feel decent about yourself, because of how great your God is and how thankful and joyful you can be, because that God is here and that God is with you and for you. Finally, there's one last sign that maybe you need to accept the invitation to grow and go deeper into the ways of God. And get ready, here it is, okay? You're breathing, okay? You're breathing. Now, if you are not breathing right now, please raise your hand. We have EMTs outside the door, right? That is a separate issue. We will come and take care of that as best we can. Otherwise, we'll have a lovely service for you and say nice things about you. But if you are breathing, you are invited through Jesus' resurrection to grow deeper in your faith. And this is what God gave us this whole life for, right? This is it. All the rest is the details. All the rest is periphery. This is what we're given this life for, right? To grow closer to God, to go deeper into God's ways of how we love and serve one another. And so it's time for us to say, if we've had this compartmentalized life where we've got our faith over here on Sunday and Monday through Friday is our deal, and then we say, God, you got Sunday, I got Monday through Friday, and we'll negotiate Saturday, right? If that's where you're at, it's time for a different faith. It's time for a different level. It's time to go deeper. Because why should we go through this life where we have one who overcame the powers of death and still live in anxiety and in insecurity and in fear? Why should we do that? I can find a lot of good reasons why we should do that out there in the world. All I have to do is grab my iPhone and pull up my news feed and start doom scrolling, and I can find plenty of reasons why we should live like that. I can't find a single one in here. I can't find a one. And so the question for us becomes, where do we get our directions for living? Do we get it from our news feed, or do we get it from the good news? Now, if you're like me, this is where I want to get my news. This is where I want to get my directions. That's where I often find myself looking for directions. Directions that sometimes produce some useful information, but just don't satisfy the soul. So I'd like to invite you to pray with me that we might all accept that invitation and extend the invitation to Jesus to come into our lives and to help us grow deeper into the ways of God. Let's pray together. Gracious Lord, we come before you and we invite you in. We thank you that you've been present in our lives when we couldn't see you, when we couldn't hear you, when we couldn't feel you, when we didn't believe in you, when we intentionally ignored you. We thank you that you did not turn away from us. We thank you for having the words of life that set our hearts on fire. And God, we now invite you in. We invite you to come into our lanes, that fire might not be quenched, but might rage for eternity. We pray this in your name. Amen.